I am continuing my read through of the Bible, but I am now coming to a transition. I have now finished up the historical books and am moving on to the wisdom and poetry books, which means this read through is going to become a lot less enjoyable for me and a lot more work. I love narrative. So the historical and narrative books of the Bible are my favorite. And I'm unfortunately not a huge fan of poetry. I know it's my deficit, but there it is. So the wisdom and poetry books, and then the prophets, which are, if memory serves, largely in poetic verse as well, are going to be a struggle for me. So from this point on, you may hear me complaining a lot in these reviews about how boring these books were and how much I struggled to pay attention. But I'm going to keep doing it because I believe it is worth the struggle. So, this is one of the foundational books of Western civilization, arguably the foundational book of Western civilization. Not everything worth doing is easy, so I am going to struggle my way through these books. So, come to the wisdom writings here and the book of Job. Now, the book of Job is a little bit confusing because there's a few different layers here. So I'm going to try and pick this apart as best I can. You may remember the book of Job from Sunday school, the story of Job. So the story of Job is relatively simple. God is having a council with the sons of God, who are according to the footnote here, the angels who make up his council. And in this council is Satan. Now, this, of course, is one of the big question marks about Christian theology. What is God doing in council with Satan? But here I am indebted to in my interpretation to the lectures on the Old Testament by Christine Hayes and other sources, who point out that in the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, Satan doesn't actually mean the devil. That's a later Christian interpretation. Satan, or the Satan, as I guess Christine Hayes refers to him, is the prosecuting attorney angel. So he's not evil incarnate in this version. He's a member of God's council whose job it is to, present evidence against the righteous, or to play devil's advocate, I guess, if that's a silly way of putting it. With that point of view, it makes a little bit more sense. If you're going with the traditional interpretation of Satan as being the archenemy of God, evil incarnate, then it makes a little bit less sense that they're sitting together at this council. But there you go, whichever interpretation you like. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat. Anyways, God says, look at my servant Job, he's completely blameless. Satan says, well, of course he's blameless. He's been very blessed. No wonder he's faithful to you. If you take away all his wealth and happiness, then he will curse you. And so God says, all right, let's put him to the test. So first of all, Satan wipes out all of Job's family, including his children, and then all of his wealth. And Job still does not curse God. And then God gives Satan permission to take away his health. So Job is afflicted with sickness and boils, and he still does not curse God. Even though his wife thinks he should. So we can check here. He struck down Job with malignant ulcers from the sole of his foot to the top of his head. Job took a piece of pot to scrape himself and went in the ash pit. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still mean to persist in your blamelessness? Curse God and die." "That is how foolish women talk," Job replied. "If we take happiness from God's hand, must we not take sorrow too?" And in all this misfortune, Job uttered no sinful word. So God, or I guess rather Satan, does everything he can to Job, short of taking his life. And Job just takes it very philosophically. Say, well, God gave us happiness and we took it. So now God is giving us sorrow and we take it. And then if we just skip to the end of the story here, the end of the book, we find the conclusion in which Job is rewarded for his faithfulness and everything is restored to him. He gets a new family, he gets new wealth, and he lives happily ever after. And that is the version of Job which is often told in Sunday schools, a simple morality tale. So God tests Job by giving him lots of suffering. Job just said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return. Yahweh give, Yahweh has taken back, blessed be the name of Yahweh. So he's just saying, well, God takes some stuff, but I'm still going to bless God. So what gets confusing here, if you get past chapter 2, is once you get into the dialogues, you have page after page of Job complaining about how he has been treated by God, which does not seem to sync up with this little narrative prologue that we just read. And this used to confuse me a little bit as a kid, but the answer to this, and again I'm indebted to Christine Hayes' lectures on the Old Testament, is that there are really two Jobs here. There's the prose story, which acts as a framework. That's in chapters 1 and 2, and again in the conclusion at the end. And then there's the poetic dialogue in between, and they actually come from different authors. So the simple morality tale here, the prose framework, is an old story, which probably is maybe not even an Israelite story. It maybe dates back to the ancient Near East. There's apparently a Babylonian version of Job. As Christine Hayes points out in her lectures, it's notable that none of the characters are Israelites. So Job lived in the land of Uz, which according to the footnote is probably in the south of Edom. So this is all taking place outside of the land of Israel. None of Job's friends are Israelites. None of the characters in this whole book are Israelites. And also, as Christine Hayes points out, there is no attempt to situate this anywhere in the historical narrative of the Old Testament. So it's just existing outside of the historical narrative with people who are not Israelites, indicating that this is an old story which was inherited from Middle Eastern neighbors. So the original story as it originally existed was just this simple morality tale. God tested Job. Job said, yeah, that's fine, I don't mind. And then God gave everything back to Job. But at some point, somebody decided to take this little story and turn it into a series of speeches and conversations about the nature of suffering. So it's interesting, isn't it? Seeing how this later author is playing on or expanding the story that's in the first part. But it doesn't fit together seamlessly, because obviously the impression that we get in these first two chapters is that Job is not complaining at all. That is immediately contradicted here when Job is complaining and complaining and complaining. But according to Wikipedia, there is a move, there has been a move recently to view this as a unitary whole. So instead of saying, okay, well, this is the original story, these are the additional dialogues, to say, okay, well, this is all just one book and we have to read it as one whole. And Christine Hayes also points that out in her lectures. She says that throughout this dialogue, Job's friends are accusing him of having sinned. So he must have sinned because this is why God is punishing him. And Job keeps maintaining his innocence. Now, Now, Christine Hayes points out that our interpretation of this poetic dialogue is informed by the prose opening. So because we, the reader, have read the prose opening, we know that Job has not sinned because that's explicitly stated in the prose opening. And so then when Job's friends are saying, you must have sinned, no, you've got to be wrong, we, the reader, know that Job's friends are wrong. And in fact, Job is right. He has not sinned, or at least half right. Job is going to blame God, which the end of the book is going to refute. So I thought that was a good point, and yet, to kind of jump ahead to the end of the book, when God finally appears at the end of the book to rebuke everybody and give his own opinion, God essentially says to Job, the world is infinitely complex and you can't hope to understand it. So don't ask me why you're suffering. The answer is beyond your comprehension. I'm obviously paraphrasing, but this is the gist of Yahweh's rebuttal. Now, this doesn't seem to fit in with the prose story that opens and closes the book, right? Because, again, we, the reader, know that actually the reason Job is suffering is quite simple. Satan and God just want to test Job. So this answer here from God doesn't seem to actually fit with the prose part of the book, in my opinion. But yeah, okay, so that out of the way. What are they actually talking about here? So I read this when I was in 7th grade or whatever, when I was reading through the Bible the first time. The narrative part, of course, was okay. I like narrative. But then when they just get talky here, I just had a hard time concentrating when I was in 7th grade. Since then, I've occasionally heard people talking about the philosophy in the book of Job and, how it wrestles with the questions of good and evil and why do bad things happen and man's place in the universe. Heard a few lectures on this book. Christine Hayes among them, her lectures on the Old Testament and talking about the book of Job. And I thought, oh, okay. Maybe this is more interesting than I gave it credit for. Maybe I was too young to understand it or didn't quite understand what the author was trying to do here. There is some interesting philosophical stuff going on in this book. And then I came back to it, and I reread it, and I thought, no, I was right the first time. This is boring. So now, first of all, apologies. As always, when you review a work of ancient poetry, and you just say, well, this is boring, to a certain extent, you're reviewing yourself, not the book, right? I'm sure that there is depth here that I'm not appreciating. I also know that as I just gave this a casual read, I just went through and read it. I didn't really try and do a deep study of this or in depth or anything like that. So perhaps I didn't get much out of it because I didn't put in the effort. But among other things, what I'm trying to do with these reviews is to just give the impression of what it's like to read through this book, just as a casual reader. And I think I'm on fairly safe ground when I say I'm not the first casual reader to approach this book and just been a little bit bored by it. So the first problem, for me at least, is it's in poetic verse. Now, if you're the kind of person who's concerned about your weekly page count, to a certain extent this is an advantage, because the poetic verse takes up a lot less space than the prose narrative block. So it's a lot easier to get through the pages. But yeah, it's one of the other things with the poetic verse is there's a lot of repetition. And this is on purpose. Obviously, this is how poetry operates. But if you're just interested in the ideas here, you're like, okay, you're just repeating yourself now. You've said what you wanted to say, and now you're just saying it in a different way, and now you're just giving examples to reinforce what you've already said. Really, the things that the individual characters are saying does not need to take up 2.5 pages like it does here. It could be summed up in just a few sentences. And in fact, the headings that the Jerusalem Bible give to each of these speeches pretty much just sums them up. So, only the sufferer knows his grief. There you go. You've got the main idea. Now, you can read the next 2.5 pages if you want to, but that's it here. And then the next one, the unswerving course of God's justice. Now, there is a little bit more here, but God's justice is above all law. Now, yeah, if you appreciate poetry, you will like these parts more. I had a hard time staying focused on this. I was doing the classic thing where I got to the end of the chapter and I realized that I hadn't been, my mind had been wandering even though my eyes had been looking at the words. And they said, all right, focus, go back to the top of the page, try it again. You know that feeling, right? We've all had books that we struggle through like that. I did discover, however, after I finished reading this book, just to try and review it, I put on an audio version of the Book of Job, which, there are lots of these available on YouTube. Just type the Book of Job audio, and there are lots of different recordings of it. I listened to an audio recording of the NIV, although I read this out of the Jerusalem Bible, but the Jerusalem Bible wasn't on YouTube that I know of. But, there are audio recordings of the King James Version, the New King James Version, the plain English recordings of this. But anyways, the one I listened to was the NIV. And I just had that on in the background the past couple days while I was doing other stuff, just trying to review what I had read, as I often do. But having this as audio helped me appreciate a little bit more. I thought, okay, there's a rhythm here. This is a little bit hypnotic. It was more interesting to listen to than it was to read, and it was more pleasurable to listen to than it was to read. There's somebody in my BookTube circle who says that when he's reading poetry, he will read it out loud. And I wonder, maybe that's the way to, if you're like me and you have a hard time focusing on poetry, maybe just reading this out loud would be the way to do it, to help you appreciate the poetry here. And I mean, as always, I guess you have to make this comment whenever you're reading poetry that's translated. What was this like in the original Hebrew, huh? I mean, who knows? But because this was translated, you just have to go with an English translation of it. So the actual dialogue between Job and his friends is very repetitive, and maybe the content of which is not so interesting. So Job is asserting over and over again that he has not sinned, he's blameless. His friends are asserting over and over again, well, you must have sinned because God is just, and you would not be suffering if you were not blameless. So it's interesting to an extent. It's not, in my opinion, interesting to the extent it goes on here, but there is some back and forth. That being said, one of the interesting things is that pops up here in the book of Job several times is references to a rather violent creation story in which God has subdued the primeval forces of nature. Now, this is not the creation story that's found in Genesis. Again, I guess it's similar to the creation myths of the Babylonians. Again, I'm reliant here on Christine Hayes and her lectures on the Old Testament, but when she talks about the creation story of Genesis, she contrasts it with the more violent stories of the God subduing the primordial forces, which are found in the Babylonian myths. And she makes the point that the Hebrews were familiar with the Babylonian myths and chose consciously to create a different creation story in the story of Genesis. And she said the reason we know that they're familiar with the Babylonian myths is because these creation stories show up elsewhere in the Bible. So I believe she mentioned Psalms as a point where these creation stories will often show up in the book of Psalms or references to them, but also the book of Job. So Job is talking about God here. And as he says, let them curse it who curse the day, who are prepared to rouse Leviathan. Now there's a little note here. So Leviathan is the dragon of primeval chaos. He might be roused by a curse against the present order. And there are other references here. There's Leviathan. There's Rahab. Now, Rahab, if you know your Bible stories, Rahab is from the book of Judges, right? But this is a different Rahab. This is another one of those primordial deities, which I guess shows up occasionally in the Bible, which God subdued at the beginning of time. Not in the Genesis account, but some of these other accounts. And here's another thing. Job says, Am I the sea or the wild sea beast? And again, the footnote here says, in the Babylonian cosmologies, the sea, personified as Tiamat, was conquered and controlled by one of the gods. In the popular imagery influenced by this story, Yahweh became the conqueror who held the seas under his control. So if you're interested in mythology and comparative mythology, here we go. Rahab from chapter 9. God never goes back on his anger. Rahab's minions still lie at his feet. Rahab stands for chaos, the first enemy conquered by God. So we don't get any more than glimpses at this alternative creation mythology. But those glimpses are fascinating if you're interested in that kind of stuff. Anyways, we go several rounds between Job and his friends. And then we get, where is it? Coming to it. The speeches of Elihu, who is otherwise sometimes known as the angry young man. Now, it is, I think every commentary I've read in the book of Job indicates that the speeches of Elihu were probably added by a later author. There's no way of knowing this for sure, but there are several indications. One indication is that Elihu, this is the first we heard of him. So he just pops out of nowhere here. All of a sudden we find out that a young man named Elihu has been watching the whole time. And Elihu is younger than everyone speaking, but he is not impressed by what everyone has been saying. What does he say to his Job's friend? He says, there was a time when I hoped for much from your speeches. I gave your reasoning a ready hearing and watched you choose your words. I gave you all my attention. And I can say that no one gave Job the lie. Not one of you disproved his statements. So they have been nonplussed, baffled for an answer. Words have failed them. I have been waiting, since they are silent and they have abandoned all efforts to reply. So this is interesting, especially if we imagine this was put in by a later author. Because it seems to be saying, well, all right, I've been listening to you talk all this time, and it's all crap. Not one of you has said anything useful. And I'm reading this, and I'm like, okay, well, finally a character who is channeling my point of view. It's interesting to have that point of view be inserted here into the story. And I think, all right, now finally we're going to get something useful in here. But Elihu actually doesn't have anything useful, despite this very strong opening. He despite him appearing to refute what Job's friends have said and say, they haven't said anything useful, he kind of largely repeats a lot of the accusations that they have made against Job, although he adds in the idea that perhaps suffering could be God's way of building character or testing people or making them stronger, something like that. But it's not, and here we go, in the real meaning of Job's suffering. It's not really, I didn't find it really all that impressive. And then we come to the speeches of Yahweh. Now, like I said earlier, Yahweh's answer to Job is essentially, you don't understand what's going on. The world is very complex, so I don't have to justify myself to you. This is kind of a paraphrase, but that's essentially what he's saying. So, in other words, it's God works in mysterious ways. Or I had a friend who once paraphrased, I guess, this mindset. He called it the Jewish view of God, which is, well, God is God. What are you going to do? God talks about all the wonders of creation, and he talks about Behemoth and Leviathan again. Now, I don't have really time to get into all the theories of Behemoth and Leviathan. They're mythical creatures, and there's again a number of different theories about what they refer to, or what we already talked about Leviathan actually as one of the primordial agents of chaos, but then there's Behemoth as well. But if you're interested in going down some rabbit holes, spend some time looking up them on Wikipedia. But God talks for some time about Leviathan here. So Leviathan 2, can you catch him with a fishhook or run a line around his tongue? Can you put a ring through his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Sorry, let me jump down here. He's still talking about Leviathan. It says, next I will talk of his limbs and describe his matchless strength. Who can loose the front of his coat or pierce the double armor of his breastplate? Who dares open the gates of the mouth and terror dwells on those rows of teeth. His back is like rows of shields, sealed with a seal of stone, touching each other so close that not a breath could pass between. And it just goes on describing Leviathan. Now, this comes after, perhaps I haven't done a good job of describing this, but if we were to go back and look at the speeches of Job, Job is accusing God, and Job is demanding to be brought to a trial with God so that he can lay out his innocence and hear God's response. And then God finally appears, and then now God's just giving this big, long description of Leviathan. It reminds me, not to be too flippant about this, but, well, I guess I'm going to be a little bit flippant. It reminds me of the Chewbacca defense from South Park, which if you haven't seen it, I'll link to it in the description down below. But it's a famous South Park episode in which Johnny Cochran, or the South Park parody of him, confuses the jury by just talking about Chewbacca instead of talking about the case. So here is, Job has all these questions about why is he suffering, and God saying, what about Leviathan, huh? Let me go and talk about Leviathan for a while. Isn't Leviathan weird? I mean, what kind of creature is Leviathan? And so, Job, to conclude, that's why you're suffering, because Leviathan is really weird. God's answer to Job is unsatisfying. Now, I've got 1 minute left before my camera shuts off, so I'm going to have to wrap this up really quickly. Christine Hayes, in her lectures on the Old Testament, which I am again borrowing from, says that Job is one of the hardest books of the Bible for modern readers to read, in part because the conclusions to it are so unsatisfactory for modern readers. I'm going to have to add myself to that. This is not a satisfactory answer to the question of why good people suffer, which is one of the central religious questions. On the other hand, to end this maybe with a bit of a positive note, the book of Job very strongly refutes the idea that people are suffering because they are evil or because they have done something wrong, which is an idea that we do find elsewhere in the Old Testament, particularly in the Deuteronomistic historian. And I think it's a net good that the Bible does forcefully condemn this view in the end, because if it didn't, perhaps the history of Christian civilization would have been a lot different if the book of Job